So our theme for tonight is a difficult one, but picking up on what we've done in the last few weeks, we're going to look at what makes grace efficacious. A couple weeks ago, we saw that God wills all men to be saved. And so He gives sufficient grace to all men. And He doesn't predestine anyone to hell, but He predestines only positively to heaven. And we saw last time that His act of predestining us includes foreknowledge of our cooperation with His grace or our resistance to that grace. And therefore, predestination has two aspects, and preparing a whole series of graces for us, but also His foreknowledge that we will cooperate with that grace, at least in the decisive moments of our life. And what we want to look at in this talk is, well, how is it that some cooperate with that grace and others fail to do so? Or even in our own lives, how is it that at some times we cooperate with that grace and at other times we don't? Right? So that's the question that we're looking at. Right? And it's a difficult question, but it's a very practical question, because we all experience in ourselves that sometimes we do cooperate with God and other times we don't. Okay, great. Right. So efficacious is when something reaches the end. Right? So we say a grace that God gives us is efficacious when it obtains its purpose. And we say that a grace is not efficacious when it fails to obtain its purpose. Right? So let's take an example. God knocks on the door of a soul, calling, and the soul opens and converts, efficacious grace. St. Paul on the way to Damascus encounters Christ, converts, is baptized, efficacious grace. St. Augustine, he comes to see that the Catholic faith is true after being a Manichae for numerous years. He comes to see that it's true, but he also sees that he has to change his life. And so he prays, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. And he explains, and not yet, because I wanted my desire to be satisfied rather than extinguished. All right, what do we call that? Not efficacious grace. Not at that moment. Later, though, it was efficacious. A couple years later, he converts and is baptized. All right? All right, so our question is, how do we explain that? That at the one moment, the grace was there in both cases. It wasn't, when St. Augustine made that prayer, Lord, make me chaste. That is being moved by the Holy Spirit. But the problem was, it didn't get its final effect, his conversion, at least not at that moment. All right, so we want to say that 2 weeks ago, or 2 sessions ago, we said that God wills all men to be saved. And since He wills all men to be saved, He calls all and gives them a grace that's truly sufficient so that they can be saved. But they have to cooperate with that grace. And sometimes we cooperate, and sometimes we fail to cooperate. All right? So God gives sufficient to all. So what do we mean by sufficient? A sufficient grace is a grace that really is sufficient to at least start me moving to conversion and salvation. A sufficient grace doesn't have to be such that I could be saved immediately. A grace is sufficient if it's sufficient to at least get me started, and then maybe I'll need another grace and I'll have to cooperate with that, and then another and another and another, until I finally say get baptized, and then I'll have to get lots more graces and persevere, so that I persevere in grace till the end. But a grace is sufficient if it's sufficient at least to move us forward. All right? Does that make sense? And so God gives sufficient grace to all so that they can move forward. All right? So that's what we mean by sufficient. It really is sufficient so that I can do something in the direction of salvation. But I might not do it. What do we mean by an efficacious grace? We just said an efficacious grace is one that not only was sufficient, but I actually do it. And so here's our question for tonight. How do we explain that difference between the merely sufficient grace and the one that actually gets its effect? And the question, we can focus it like this. Is there an intrinsic difference in the graces themselves? In other words, is it that God gave a different grace to the one who does the good act than to the one who is called but doesn't follow through? In other words, is the difference, on whose part is the difference? On the part of the grace from God, or is the difference on the part of the person who responds or doesn't respond? Right? That's the question. Okay? Now, not all theologians give the same answer. How would Calvin answer that? Or, in general, the original Protestant tradition? They would say that the difference is on the part of the graces. That if God gives a true grace, it's going to be efficacious. In other words, for Calvin, only the efficacious ones, only the ones that get their effect, are really graces. And he doesn't, for Calvin, give that to all. Anyway, so a couple of weeks ago, we looked at this, and we saw that there's a huge problem there. If God doesn't give, if the only way I can be converted is if God gives me an efficacious grace, and if God doesn't give that to all men, how does he truly will all men to be saved? Right? That's a huge problem. And how is it that Christ, if that were the case, died for all men? If he doesn't give to all really what they would need to be converted and be saved. And so the Calvinist answer was that Christ didn't die for all men, but only died for the elect. And to the elect, he gives an irresistible grace. But to the reprobate, he doesn't give that irresistible grace, and so they are predestined to hell. More or less, that's the... And the problem with that is obvious. By the way, that's summarized. An easy way to memorize this is the acronym TULIP. And so here we're looking at the I, which is irresistible grace. TULIP is kind of an acronym for the 5 points of Calvinism. And the L would be limited atonement. Christ didn't die for all, but just for the elect. That's the limited atonement. And in the Catholic Church, there was also a heresy that followed the same idea, and it was Jansenism. Jansenism likewise held that all grace is irresistible. If you get an irresistible grace, it will be efficacious by its very nature. You can't resist it. And only some get it, and therefore Christ only died for some, for the elect. And what did the church do? The church condemned it infallibly. Right? So it's a heresy to say that Christ did not die for all men. And therefore it's a dogma of faith that Christ did die for all men. And likewise, it's a heresy to say that God commands the impossible. And God would be commanding the impossible if He required us to follow His commands and then doesn't give us the irresistible grace necessary to do it. And the Jansenist heresy said that God commands things that you can do if He gives you irresistible grace, but you simply can't do if He doesn't, and He gives that grace to some and not to others. And that's a heresy, right? That got condemned as heretical because God wills all men to be saved. And so if He commands something, at the same time as He commands it, what does He do? He gives you the sufficient grace to do it, or at least to ask for more grace. He at least gives you the sufficient grace to ask for more grace and start a process of conversion so that you can do what He commands. Right? So God never commands the impossible. Okay? Now, that's what the church has taught infallibly. But given that, so basically what have we said? God wills all men to be saved, and therefore He gives sufficient grace to all men. And it's clear that grace we have to cooperate with. And we have to freely cooperate with it, and we could also fail to cooperate with it. And that's how we explain the fact that not all follow through, that not all are converted, and not all will be saved. Right? That's basically the parameters. Nevertheless, one of the things what we're going to look at right now is a debate inside Catholic theology, and it's a very interesting debate from 400 years ago. So we're just going to revive this old 400-year debate and look at it to see how it illuminates our problem. Shortly after the Reformation, about 40 years after it, after the Council of Trent, there arose a discussion between two schools of theology within the Catholic Church, one headed by the Dominicans and the other headed by the Jesuits. And there was a real, it's hard for us to imagine the passion that went into this theological dispute. Each side, it started with a Jesuit theologian named Molina, Luis de Molina. And Luis de Molina was a theologian who wrote a book on predestination, in which he gave a theory of what we're talking about tonight. How is it that God gives sufficient grace to all, but not all end up cooperating? And so his solution was this, that God gives sufficient grace to all, and the grace is the one converts and the other doesn't convert, not because the graces are different, but because we have free will. And because of that free will, I can follow through on the grace, or I can not follow through on it, resisting it. And there's more to it than that, but that's enough for our purpose at the moment. And the Dominicans, the Dominican theologians, accused it of being heretical. And they accused it of being heretical because it seemed that, to them, it was too close to Pelagianism. It seemed like it's up to me whether I resist or accept the graces, and therefore my salvation is more up to me than it is up to God. Something like that. And they worked out a rival system to explain this. And their solution was, well, an efficacious grace is intrinsically different from a merely sufficient grace. In other words, the reason, so two people are given grace, one converts and the other doesn't. How do we explain it? The Dominican solution was, God gave to the one a different kind of grace than to the other. To the one He gave a intrinsically efficacious grace, and to the other He gave a sufficient but not intrinsically efficacious grace. In other words, the difference is on the part of God and not on the part of man. And then, all right, so that's how the debate. And so then the Jesuits counter. So they were first accused of being Pelagians. Then they accused the Dominicans of being Calvinists. And you can see why, because the Dominican theory was authored by a particular theologian named Bañez, who was actually a very great man in many other ways. He was the confessor of St. Teresa of Avila, and a great theologian. But his theory was that the efficacious grace is intrinsically different than the merely sufficient one. And so Molina said, well, how is that different from Calvinism? In other words, that God gives to some irresistible grace, and to others he simply doesn't. And so you had, each side was accusing the other of being heretics, and these two orders were the largest and most important religious orders in the Catholic Church, and most theologians were actually members of these orders, or at least a large number of them were. And so you had a terrible dispute. And it ended up going to the Pope. And the Pope formed a commission to study it. And it just so happened that the commission was headed by members of the Inquisition. Now, the Inquisition was traditionally run by the Dominicans. And so the Dominicans had an advantage in this. And so this commission decided that the Jesuit book, the book by Molina, should be censored and banned. But the Pope thought that was too hasty a decision, and so he said, well, I'm going to look into this myself. And so he ordered that the case be presented before the College of Cardinals with him present. What happened? They had one debate, and then they needed another, and then they needed another, and it went on for 65 debates in the presence of the Pope. Each of these debates lasted something like 4 to 8 hours, 4 to 7 hours. And then the Pope died. Right, that's right. Some people, I haven't seen this verified, but people say that he had prepared a document in which he was ready to condemn the Jesuit position. I'm not sure if that's absolutely true, but people say that. But in any case, he died, and that never got executed. All right. His successor didn't do anything. He died, and then the next successor revived the debate and had followed the same method, had them debated in his presence before the College of Cardinals, and you had 1, 2, 3, something like 18 sessions, or 17 sessions, before this Pope Paul V, I believe his name was, and fruitless. And so he asked the advice of a saint, St. Francis de Sales, what he ought to do. And St. Francis de Sales, actually, in his writings, you can see he favored one of the two positions. His writings are more on the side of the Jesuit position. But his advice was, condemn neither side, but order them not to condemn each other, so that neither side could say that the other is a heretic. Each side could teach their own view, but nobody can write a new work on grace without the permission of the Holy See. And they have to be willing to accept the decision of the Holy See when it comes. We're still waiting, right? It never came. So that's how it got left. Right? It's just very interesting. So it's one of the great open questions that never got resolved in the history of theology. And some 85 sessions before the Holy, it's unimaginable to us, or hard to imagine. But in those days, so why did this happen? In those days, this was a burning issue. Predestination was one of the principal issues in the Reformation. And so you can see why the theological passions were aroused. And also because this is a supremely difficult subject. Right? So what should we think about this? Well, I'm going to give you the solution that I think is right. Church gives us liberty to do so. All right. But first, let's look at the two positions. All right. So the Dominican position, which is that of Báñez, right? So whenever you see Báñez, that's the Dominican view, is that efficacious grace is efficacious because it infallibly moves the soul to consent. Right? It moves the will to consent to conversion. Infallibly. By its own power. And he calls that pre-motion. God pre-moves the will. In other words, how should we understand this? My will, my intellect moves my will when I make a choice. And God is moving both. Right? And so God is pre-moving my will, moving it to consent to salvation, to some salvific act. Say, going to confession, praying, making an act of contrition. Right? So God is pre-moving my will to bring about my salvific act. And he does this to defend the sovereignty of God. And he does it to defend God's infallible knowledge of who will be saved and who won't from all eternity. Right? From all eternity, God knows what we will do freely in time. And so Báñez says he knows it because he knows. So how does he know my free act here today? Because he knows what grace he wants to give me. He knows that he wants to give me an efficacious grace, or he wants to withhold that efficacious grace. So God from all eternity knows what we do because he knows that he will give this kind of grace or not. And if he gives it, I will consent, and if he doesn't, I won't. Right? And then he says, but it still happens freely. It still happens freely because God moves me in a way proper to me. And the way proper to a human being is to be moved freely. Right? So his position is that God moves us infallibly, but still freely, to do the good act. And he does it by an intrinsically efficacious grace. All right, that's a summary of the position. The problem with this, so let's look at some of the problems. The first problem that comes to mind is that looks very similar to the Calvinist position. It's just that the terms have changed and something else. So let's look at so what's similar with the Calvinist position? What Báñez calls efficacious grace looks like irresistible grace. And God's sovereignty was precisely the key issue for Calvin. Calvin wanted to defend God's sovereignty, and that's what the Dominican position is also defending. The difference lies in this, that Calvin basically admits that we don't have the free will to cooperate in salvation directly as a result of the fall, as a result of, that's another part of the tulip, that's the first, total depravity. Right? So the T in tulip stands for total depravity. Because of that total depravity, we've lost that freedom to cooperate or not cooperate in salvation. Whereas this position of Báñez says, no, that's not right. We really are free. And God respects that freedom. But he moves us in such a way that we infallibly, yet freely, choose the right thing. Choose the salvific good. So what's the problem with this? So let me go through some problems. Báñez insists that God truly gives sufficient grace to all, but only to some he gives efficacious grace. Right? An obvious problem is, well, how is the sufficient grace that he gives to all really sufficient? If only to some he gives an efficacious grace that infallibly gets its result, and the merely sufficient never gets its result. So how is it truly sufficient? I don't know how to answer that. I think that's the biggest problem. Another problem is, how does God truly will the salvation of all men, according to this explanation? Because if He truly wills the salvation of all men, God, that will to save all should be translated into a grace that really can produce my salvation. Right? And that's a revealed truth. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 4. That God desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. But if I can't be saved without getting an efficacious grace, and efficacious grace isn't given to all, then how does God truly will the salvation of all men? And there are other texts of Scripture that seem to show that we really can resist grace, and we do it frequently. For example, Revelation chapter 3, verse 20. God says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him and he with me." But not all open the door. And so we want to say that when God knocks, right, He's knocking. A few weeks ago, we made a distinction between operative and cooperative grace. Let's draw that back to mind. The process of conversion always starts with God taking the initiative. God knocks on the door of our soul. How does He knock? He gives us some light in our intellect to see. It might be my conscience, seeing that my life is not right. It might be seeing that there's an emptiness that I need to... It might be seeing that I need to make an act of contrition. Or it might be seeing that I need to pray. A light to my intellect. And then He touches our will to excite it to our supernatural end. And we call that operative grace, because God's operating directly without me. He touches my conscience without my inviting Him. In other words, He takes the initiative. All right. But what happens then? Two things can happen. He can knock, and I can turn a deaf ear. Or He can knock, and I can hear. If I hear and start to act on what He's shown me, He continues to support my action by giving what we call cooperative grace. Now His grace is cooperating with me because I'm moving to salvation. But at any moment, I can stop cooperating and the movement will stop. Right, so how is it that when the Lord knocks, right, sometimes we open, sometimes we don't? Well, it's because His knocking is efficacious as knocking, but it requires me to cooperate. And I can do it or withhold it. Okay. Let's look at the let me make another. St. Margaret Mary, this Alacoque of the Sacred Heart, she received a revelation in which Jesus complains bitterly that people aren't responding to His graces. Right? That He's lavished such graces, particularly on Catholics, on religious, on priests, on those to whom He gives special favors. And what does He get in return? Coldness. And so He's complaining. That seems to imply that it's not on... Where's the problem? On God's part or on man's part? And clearly, not on God's part, but on man's part, otherwise he wouldn't complain. Another example would be from so many times in Scripture. For example, in Isaiah chapter 5, there's the parable of the vineyard. Right? And the Lord makes a vineyard, and He gives it everything that it needs, and He's expecting fruit. No, He's expecting grapes. And what does He get? Sour grapes. And so what does that show us? That God, the problem isn't that God is failing to give something that we need for conversion, but rather that the creature isn't cooperating with what God is giving. Another way to say it is that when St. Thomas explains the process of salvation, he says that there are two causes in the salvation of a person. Who are the two causes? God's obviously the first cause, but the creature is the second cause. Right? And both parties have to cooperate to get the effect. Well, God never fails in His action. The failure can only be on the part of the creature. Right? So salvation can be lost not from a defect on God's part, but only from a defect on man's part. And another problem is with this position is that why is it Mary's always interceding for us, right? Mary's our mother. She intercedes. All of us are her children. She's interceding for us before the throne of God to win for us graces. If she's doing that, how is it that anybody could ever not be saved? How would Jesus not listen to her intercession and give an efficacious grace? In other words, if the only reason why a grace is efficacious is because God makes it infallibly efficacious, how can we explain the fact that not all are given those efficacious graces? So for all of these reasons, the other school, the Jesuit school, said that, held the position that it's man's cooperation or failure to cooperate that causes the fact that some graces are efficacious and others are not. So yes, Mary's interceding for all of us, and because of that intercession, God is giving to all those touches, those operative graces, sufficient grace to start them on the process of conversion. But why is it that not all are converted? Because we resist that grace sometimes, not all the time. Okay. All right, so let's look now at the Jesuit, the position of Molina. And so, according to this other theory, sufficient grace is truly sufficient for us to cooperate with it. If I cooperate with it, by the fact that I cooperate with it, it becomes efficacious. If I don't cooperate with it, it ends up being merely sufficient, but not efficacious. Why? Not for a lack on God's part, but for a lack on my part, failing to follow through with what grace suggested and moved me to and inspired in me. Okay? And thus, the second position is saying God's grace is not irresistible. The initial grace, in a sense, gets its effect whether I want it or not. God touches the conscience even of the worst criminal. But that's only the operative grace. It's what happens after that depends on us. Okay? Does everybody follow that? So, the key thing here is that grace is not irresistible. I can resist it or fail to resist it. The second thing that they did, the Jesuit position, is stress that they had to answer the objection about God's sovereignty. Because if it depends on me to cooperate, how does God remain sovereign? And how does His plan remain infallible if I can foil it? Right? It seems that there's a problem there. And so they answered that God's plan is infallible because He foresees what I'm going to do from all eternity. He foresees that I'm going to resist this, but not resist that. That I'm going to resist maybe a whole series, but I'm not going to resist this other one, etc. And so God, by foreseeing our resistance or non-resistance, He has a plan of providence that takes all of that into account. For example, from all eternity, God decreed to give to Adam a certain grace, Adam and Eve. But He also knew from all eternity that with that grace, which was truly sufficient for them to be faithful, He also foresaw that they wouldn't be faithful and that they would fall and all of us would inherit original sin. And so God's providential plan took that into account from all eternity, and He decreed a remedy, which is the incarnation of Christ and the founding of the church and His passion and all the sacraments, etc. And so God's plan is infallible because from all eternity it takes into account our free cooperation or resistance to grace. Right? And it takes into account what we would do if we're given grace and the creature's cooperation. And so what happened, how should we understand predestination in this way? Well, predestination would be God preparing a whole series of graces for each person, but also His foreknowing that some of those graces will be resisted, others will be accepted, and knowing that, say, this person will be baptized, or will refuse to be baptized, or if he is baptized, he'll persevere, or he'll fall away, or if he falls away, that he'll come back, etc. Knowing all of that and preparing the graces to the end. Right? That would be how this position would understand God's providential plan. And, well, is this different from Calvinism? Yes, because God only prepares positive graces for everyone, so He doesn't predestine anyone to hell. But furthermore, He truly gives sufficient grace to all, such that everyone has what they need to be saved. And thus, if anyone isn't saved, they can't complain that they weren't given something essential, like an intrinsically efficacious grace or an irresistible grace. They were given what's truly sufficient to be saved. But those who are not saved, it will be because they didn't cooperate. And so the beauty of this solution is that it takes both things that we want to emphasize into account. God's universal salvific will and man's true free will to cooperate with that or frustrate it. And on top of that, the infallibility of God's plan remains because of God's knowledge and His ability to give further remedies. If I resist one, He can give me another. Right? God from all eternity foresaw that St. Augustine was going to resist the grace that he got at that time when he said, "Lord, give me chastity, but not yet." And God prepared other graces for him that He knew he wouldn't say no to, etc. Okay. Now, why is it that the Jesuits came up with this? I think it has to do with the direction given them by St. Ignatius at the time of the Reformation. St. Ignatius, in his spiritual exercises, he has notes at the end about thinking with the church. And in that part at the end, he gives this advice to preachers not to speak too much about predestination. And especially not to speak about it in such a way that it implies that it's all in God's hands and doesn't depend on me. Because he thought that would make people too passive. In other words, and that's exactly what was happening in that part of Europe, which came under the influence of Protestantism. Okay. Let's look, though, at some of the objections against the Jesuit position. So a first objection that was made was that it seemed to do away with the fact that God is the first mover. If we say that my salvation depends on whether I resist or cooperate, it sounds like I'm making myself the first cause of my salvation. And so that's why this position was often called Pelagian, or accused of being Pelagian. It depends on me to cooperate or resist, and so it seems that I'm the first author. Or another way to say it is, how is it that how do I choose to cooperate with God's plan? All right, so how should we answer that? This might be a little too difficult I'll do my best. I think the way to answer this is that God moves everything in a way fitting to the thing that he moves. God's the first mover of everything in the universe. But he moves rocks in a way proper to rocks, which is without freedom. They just go down. He moves animals in a way proper to animals according to their instincts. He moves human beings in a way proper to human beings with freedom. How does he do that? That's our question. So how does God move a free creature? All right. The way that St. Thomas Aquinas explains this is God moves a free creature by moving him to desire happiness. Each one of us desires happiness. How is it that we desire happiness? It's our nature. How is it that we have such a nature? God made such a nature, and he activates it. All of our free choices in the course of our life, why do we make any choice that we make? Because we want to be happy. And maybe we make very bad choices. But even those terrible choices that we make, why do we make them? Because we think that those choices are going to realize happiness somehow. And so everything else that we do because we want to be happy. Well, how did God moved us to desire happiness, and then we can move ourselves to desire a particular way to be happy. In other words, I can be my own self-mover, but only because I'm first moved by God. In other words, God moves me to desire happiness, and once I desire happiness, which is the complete good, I can move now myself to desire a particular thing as a realization or way to be happy. So the free creature really moves himself. That's what it means to be free, right? To move yourself. How can I move myself? Because God is first moving me in a way that's not free, right? I'm not free to desire happiness or not to desire happiness. God moves me to do that. But once he's moved me to do that, I can freely move myself to come to this lecture, or to eat chocolate cake, or to get married, or to do whatever it is that I think will lead to happiness. And so, whatever I choose, is God the first mover of my choice? Yes, because he moved me to desire happiness. And I never would have chosen to come here tonight if I hadn't desired happiness. So he's the first mover that we're here tonight. But did we freely choose to come here tonight? Yes, of course. Did God pre-move us, predetermining us to want to come here tonight? No. He just pre-moved us to desire happiness. But we then have to pre-move ourselves to a particular thing. Right? That's in the natural order. The same thing happens analogously on the supernatural order. I'm never going to desire salvation if God doesn't move me to do so. In other words, the first movement towards heaven has to come from God, who excites my will to desire a supernatural good and moves my mind to believe that there's a supernatural good like heaven. But once He's moved me to desire heaven, now I can move myself to the means to get to heaven. Like, I don't know, praying, like going to Mass, like entering the RCA program, like reading about the faith, like going to confession. And I freely do that. But is He the first mover? So anyone goes to the confessional, who's the first cause of that person going to the confessional? God. Because without God's grace, the person would never have desired heaven in the first place. But we still have to choose the means, and we all know by our personal experience that we've chosen these means, and other times we've chosen those means, and God allows us that freedom to choose this or that, and He doesn't predetermine us to do this or that. But He's still the mover if I do the good act. So suppose I do the good act and I go to confession. Who gets the glory? Well, God, because He moved me, starting the process. If I don't and I block it, who gets the blame? Me, because He still moved me, but I blocked the process. Pelagianism is thinking that we can be sufficient to be self-movers starting the process. Right? That's Pelagianism. Pelagianism is to say that I can be sufficient to desire heaven, to believe in the gospel, and therefore to choose the means to get to heaven all by myself. And all God needs to do is reveal His truth. He needs to reveal it and maybe send a preacher to me. But He doesn't need to move me inside. That's false. Because God needs to give that, we called it an operative grace, a grace by which He touches me inside so that I first desire heaven. Once I've desired it, now I can start moving myself to that supernatural goal. But of course I'll need God to help me. And that we call cooperative grace. God starts the process with operative grace or prevenient grace, and He carries through this cooperative grace. But I'm free to choose this way or that way. Right? To get married, to go to religious life, to whatever it may be. Okay? Yeah. And this solution also shows the great importance of my disposition. God gives sufficient grace to all. He touches all. Why is it that one cooperates and the other doesn't? Our freedom, but also our habits. This is huge. He touches each person, but each one of us have habits, which may be virtues or may be vices. And how I respond to God's grace, what will that depend on? In large part on my predisposition, which is my habits, my virtue and my vice, my attachment to certain things. And so, God touches somebody who's attached to sin. The person can cooperate with the grace and renounce the sin, or because of the attachment to the sin, he can disregard the grace. And so our habits have a great deal to do with how we respond to God's grace. They don't predetermine it, because I can go against my habit. That's conversion. But it's hard. And usually we don't. But God can always give a stronger grace. But no matter how strong a grace, I'm still free to cooperate or not. Right, an addiction is a great example. That addiction serves as a predisposition that makes it so much harder to follow through. Right? So suppose I'm an alcoholic, and I get an operative grace from God at touching my conscience to see that my condition is bad, and that I need to do something. My addiction makes it much harder for me to receive that grace and cooperate with it. It doesn't make it impossible, because I can do something, right? What can I do? I can pray to God for help, and I could go, say, to AA and get support and have the support of my spouse, etc. I can do various things. But surely it's much more difficult if I have that addiction than if I don't. God's grace can still work in both cases, but our disposition influences greatly the efficacy of the grace or not. Right? Sure, there's another factor here, and that's the devil. He's also playing in this process, and he's trying to pose obstacles to the graces that God is sending. The obstacles the devil poses obviously can be overcome, because God never allows us to be tempted more than we can correspond to. But of course, I can give in to those temptations, and frequently do. Let's look at another objection. Another objection is, how is it that we've got two people? So, Molina, the author of the Jesuit position, the one that I'm arguing for, if you haven't figured that out, is Molina said this: it may happen that two people, this is on page 7 at the bottom, it may happen that two persons receive in an equal degree the interior grace of vocation. God knocks. Let's just suppose he knocks equally. God actually doesn't do things equally. He distributes his graces unequally. But let's just suppose, for our argument, that God gives two equal graces to two different people. So Molina says it can happen that one of them, of his own free will, is converted, and the other remains an infidel. In other words, isn't converted. One seeks baptism and the other doesn't. It could even happen that one receives a greater, suppose God doesn't give two equal graces to the two people. Suppose he gives a greater grace to the one and a lesser grace to the other. Can it happen that the one to whom he gives a lesser grace converts, and the one to whom he gives a greater grace doesn't convert? Well, Molina says yes, because it's in our free will that to correspond or not. And it can happen that we get greater graces than somebody else, and we don't convert. And the person who got the lesser graces did. And Jesus alludes to this in the Gospel when he criticizes Chorazin and Bethsaida, the towns in which he did his great miracles. He says to them, "Woe unto you, Chorazin and Bethsaida, because if the miracles that had been done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have converted in sackcloth and ashes long ago." In other words, Jesus is saying that two people getting an equal grace, it happens that one can convert and the other not. Or it can happen that we resist greater graces than somebody else who gets lesser. In fact, we see this, it seems, all the time. All of us who are in the Catholic Church, in reality, have received far greater graces than those who don't have all of those means of salvation at their disposal. And yet, all the time it happens that they put us to shame. St. Francis of Assisi would say that he was the worst person on earth. And he would go around saying this all the time. No? And people would say, "What are you talking about? How can you say that you're the worst person on earth? If you're clearly in a state of grace and doing all these wonderful things, and there are other people out there who are murderers and infidel." And so St. Francis answers, "Well, I've been given greater graces than they have. And I know I've resisted them. And I know that if they were to have received the same graces that I've received, they would be a billion times better." So you can see he's presupposing precisely this, that the fact that God gives a greater grace doesn't mean that I necessarily will convert, but it depends on my freedom. Another way to pose the objection, how is it that one person becomes better than another? The Dominican answer was, well, one person becomes better than another only because God gives an efficacious grace, intrinsically efficacious to the one, to make them better than the other. Does one person convert and the other not? The only answer could be because God willed them a greater good. That was the Dominican position. How could one be better than another? Not because God willed them a greater good. So that's kind of the objection. What should we respond? Well, I think there's a simple response. Everyone who does good, why do they do good? Because God gave them a gift. So if I ever do good, what's the reason? God started the process, and so He gets all the glory. But I can't make myself better just by myself. Right? I can't make myself. If I do well, it's only because God moved me to do well. So God's got to be the source of every good and every progress. But is God the source of the opposite? Is God the source of my resisting? No. Who's the source of that? Myself. So, I can't make myself better than God's gift to me. But can I make myself worse than God's gift to me? Yes. Why can I do that? Because we're made out of nothing. And we have the power of nothingness. That's a poetic way of putting it. In other words, the created will has the power to annihilate God's movement, to make it nothing. But we don't have the power in and of ourselves to give us a supernatural movement. That has to come from God. But we do have the power in ourselves to block it. So I can't make myself better than the next person without God's gift to me. But I can make myself worse than the next person because of blocking God's gift to me. So is it possible that God gives the same grace to two people, one converts, the other doesn't? Yes. Not from a fault on God's part, but from a fault on our part.
But we can add to our graces.
That's right.
Act.
That's right.
So that is adding to God's graces.
That's true. But how? Okay, great. So how does that happen? If I cooperate with the grace of God, what happens? God will give me a greater grace. That's what merit. So it's coming from God. Right? In other words, every time we cooperate with God's grace, if we're let's suppose we're in a state of grace. If we're in a state of grace and we cooperate with God's grace to do a good act, God has pledged to give an increase of grace. And He'll be faithful to His pledge always. And so that's what we call merit. Every time we do a good act in a state of grace, who's it being ultimately moved by? By God, because I'm in a state of grace and I'm being moved by grace, and if I correspond to that grace, God will give me more grace. But I'm not adding to it. Who's adding to it? God is. Right? So that's why all the glory to God, but the blame, where does that go? To me. Now, Calvinists make an objection that the Catholic system leads to boasting. So let's look at that. They say it leads to boasting because I have to cooperate, and therefore if I'm converted, it seems that it's the same objection that we just had. It seems that I'm the cause. And thus, all those in heaven are going to be going around flexing their spiritual muscles and saying, we're here because we cooperated. And you're down there because you failed to cooperate. All right, so how should we answer? We've already said it. Every good that we do, where did it come from? From God, who started the process without which we never would have been able to cooperate. And all we did was carry through on a movement that we didn't start, but that God started. There's in the Gospel of Luke, there's the parable about the steward who, after working all day, the master is the master going to praise him? No. The master's going to say, "Come now and serve me dinner." And at the end of this, the steward says, or the servant, I'm just, how does it go? I'm an unprofitable servant. All I've done is what I was commanded to do. Right? And that's exactly what we say. I'm an unprofitable servant. All I've done was correspond to the movement that you gave. If we do good. But if we do badly, what do we say? You gave me sufficient to move me, but I turned a deaf ear. And that was my fault and not yours. Whereas in the Calvinist position, or I think also that of Vanya's, who would be at fault? I would be able to say, you didn't give me the irresistible grace that I needed. You didn't give me. In other words, we would be able to complain before God that you didn't give me an aid that I really absolutely needed in order to be saved. And that can never happen. And so every good that we do, all the glory goes to God. And every bad that we do, the blame goes to us. And therefore, boasting is excluded. But mea culpa, mea maxima culpa is not excluded, but is written in, right? Is required. Right, does that make sense? So, our explanation doesn't lead to boasting, but quite the contrary. It leads to the attitude of St. Francis that I mentioned before. Whenever we find ourselves seeing that we're doing good, and sometimes that happens, what should we think? We should think, that's through God's grace. And He's given me great graces. And true humility isn't denying that He's given me graces. True humility is recognizing that He's given me graces, and yet I've resisted so many of them. And therefore it's very reasonable to think that my neighbor over here, who happens to be a serial murderer, if he had been given the same graces that I've received, he would put me to shame. That's what we all ought to think. Because we know we resist God's grace. And it's true that God doesn't give His graces equally. There would be boasting if God gave His graces equally. Then we could boast. Now, if we knew, all right, God gives His graces to all. That person over there is a serial murderer. Clearly, he's resisting those graces, and I'm not a serial murderer. Clearly, right? That's the Pharisee in the gospel, the Pharisee and the publican. The Pharisee was saying, I thank you, God, because I fast twice a week and I give tithes, and I'm not like that publican over there. Right? If God gave His graces to all equally, perhaps we could say something like that. But the fact is, He doesn't give them equally. And we have received in abundance. And yet we know that we've resisted so many of those graces. And therefore, we ought to think that not only are we unprofitable servants, but we're worse than our neighbor. Because if they had received those graces that I've received, well, of course they would be better. It's only reasonable. It's only charitable. And so this is how we can always think. St. Paul tells us in the letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, to always think of our neighbor as better than ourselves. And we might say, well, how can I do that? How can I think that Adolf Hitler, for example, is better than me? And the only way I can do it is by thinking like this. If he had received the graces that I've received, he would probably put me to shame. But there's free will. That's right, there's free will. And I know that my free will has resisted His grace. I know that Adolf Hitler's has resisted His grace too. All right, more. but he didn't get the same graces. That's all I'm saying. There is free will. Absolutely there's free will. But there's also an unequal distribution. And therefore, I can always think that my neighbor would have done better if they had received what I've received.
You might have received more, but you don't have to.
Right, we don't know that. That's right. Okay. All right. Okay. So boasting is excluded. One last consideration. Basically what we've been talking about here is two different models of how God governs the world. How God exercises His providence. One way for God... it's easy to exercise providence over inanimate things. Right? You just move them. But how do you exercise providence over free creatures? That's the difficulty. right, the Calvinist solution is that God exercises his providence over free creatures by giving to some irresistible graces and not giving it to others. And basically the system of Vanya's, I think, comes very similar. He gives to some efficacious graces and to others he doesn't. And so from all eternity, he knows what's going to happen because to some he's giving these efficacious graces and others he's not. And so God has a plan of providence that's infallible because he knows what he's going to give. That's one way for God to rule the universe. Another way for God to govern the universe is to know from all eternity that he's going to give these graces, and to know from all eternity that the creature is freely going to accept them or not accept them at this moment and to the end. And thus he governs the world of free creatures with an infallible plan only because he foreknows our cooperation or not. And that way of the governing the world is governing a world of free creatures, but really allowing the free creatures to freely accept or not accept. And it seems to me that second kind of, let's take another example. Take a director of a play. The director of the play can, or a manager of business, the manager can micromanage everything. And that would be one way to govern a business. The manager makes all the decisions. But another way to govern the business is to give real responsibility but to form them so that they'll make their own decisions well. Right? And the same for a director in a play. To allow them to determine themselves, but to form them so that they'll determine themselves well. Right? That's a better way of providence. So it seems to me that's the kind of providence that God exercises over the world. He prepares for us a series of graces. He knows that some of them we're going to accept and some we're not. But he can always add new remedies, knowing that we're going to not accept these. Right? So God from all eternity, knowing St. Augustine is going to resist this grace, and he's going to say, Lord, give me chastity, but not yet. He prepares another remedy 2 years later, and that was meeting St. Ambrose. And he also foreknows that he could resist that grace, but he won't. And he'll become a doctor of the church, etc. And so it seems to me that that's how God governs the world. So we remain free to resist his grace. His plan takes into account our free response, but we need to pray to him always to give us more grace and to give our neighbor more grace, because that's also how we participate in his plan. His plan includes not only our free resistance, but our intercession for our neighbor so that our neighbor can be given more aids. Right? And so, in this way, we're all responsible not only for our own salvation, but also, and this is somewhat terrifying or awesome, also for our neighbor, to the degree that we intercede also for our neighbor to get graces that otherwise wouldn't be given. Let's take our break here.